If you haven't ordered your copy of Peter Hart's new book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, now is the time to do it. The Gallipoli Evacuation was one of the most important chapters of the entire Gallipoli story, and this is the first book to explore it in detail. From dithering politicians in London, to the winter storms, to the ingenious ruse that enabled the Allies to escape, such as the self-firing rifles and the silent periods, this book tells the whole gripping story of this life and death gamble. And Peter Hart really is the man to tell this story with his wonderful writing style, his insightful accounts of the history, and most importantly, his use of quotes from veterans of the campaign. The story of the Gallipoli Evacuation is really told in the words of the men who were there. The book is now available in softcover or ebook, and you can order it all over the world and pay in your local currency. So visit our website, livinghistorytv.com, to order your copy today.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hello and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History Podcast. I'm here with lovely Gary Bain, the sex symbol of Tottenham, and I've also got a very, 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 very special guest, Jim Grundy, of Solomon fame. He's never heard that before in his entire life. That's all completely new to him. Now, who is Jim Grundy and why have we polluted our airwaves with him? Well, the reason is because he is the one of the founders of Gallipoli 1915, the Facebook page, and he is the founder and sole proprietor of the wonderfully named Small Town Great War 1914-18, which is just brilliant. And it's partly these two Facebook pages that gave us the idea for this podcast, because we've noticed a certain theme. Jim, have you noticed anything that crops up on your pages more often than, say, other things?
I think there might be one or two people who are often described as heroic, but not necessarily by anybody who knew them.
You mean they're not all heroes?
Do you know, I think some of them weren't.
That's right. And people have this habit of putting heroes all, or along with RIP and we will remember them. Now, Gary, we understand why people want to remember soldiers of the Great War, but and we, of course, that's at the heart of our interest in the Great War. But you want to make a couple of points about soldiers in the Great War or any other war, don't you?
Yeah, I think we should point out the name of this podcast is actually Heroes All. That's what we've decided to call it. And it's worth remembering that any armed force, Army, Navy, and the non-military Air Force, are all recruited from the society from which they come. So you get every sort of type of person in the military that you get in society. The other thing I want to make clear is that we are making no judgments at all about whether or not their service impacted them in such a way that their later behaviour was a direct result of their suffering. And we want to make that very clear up front, because this is going to be controversial, Pete. I think whether the Air Force is a military force is already controversial.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Oh, God, what a way to start. How are we meant to be serious after that? I want to assure our listeners that we have the highest respect for the RAF and all who served in the... Probably. Oh, I made it worse. I'll shut up. Right, so Heroes All, that's what this podcast called. And we're going to go through some people to which this might not apply. They really aren't heroes. And the first one we're going to look at is 4 or 5 of these have been researched by Jim from his massive archive on people in Nottinghamshire. And we've done a couple just for fun, myself and young, voluptuous Gary. The first one we're going to do is Frank Belshaw. Now, tell me about Frank Belshaw, Jim. What was he like? Well, just give us some background to him.
Yeah, he was born in Nottingham in 1885. He was the oldest son of Henry and Rebecca Pearson. Didn't live in the nicest area of Notts, in Stenton, and he made his job peddling his wares as a street seller, so it could be just any old thing. Not the best circumstances. When war came along, he volunteered, and he was one of those blokes who actually went off literally within a few weeks of volunteering. So he's straight off. He's not obviously given a rifle, trusted with anything like that. He's given a labouring job with the Service Corps. He has about a year's service on the Western Front, and then the army sends him home. When he gets back to Nottingham, he runs a boarding house.
So he's discharged?
He's discharged.
We don't know why, though, particularly.
Well, we'll come on to the reasons why, because the reason why he said he was discharged wasn't necessarily what the army thought he was discharged.
And presumably, in a time of war, that was quite uncommon.
Well, it's before conscription. I think the army was being a bit more choosy at that time.
Bloody choosy when I was in.
Peter, you're silent there.
Yes. So, sorry to interrupt. Carry on, Jim.
Anyway, so he's running this boarding house, and the police come round to inspect it. He doesn't let them in. And when the police insist that they really are going to go in, he tells them where to go. So in September of 1915, he's been out of the army a month or so. He's brought to court, and I think Gary's got what Mr. Frank Belshaw had to say for himself.
I've been serving my country. Why can't he, at which point he indicated the officer, go and do his bit? He's a young fellow. And look, turning around, there are some more of them. Why can't they go instead of doing this sort of dirty work?
Well, naturally, the magistrate said, well, why don't you go back in the army then, mate?
Well, I was discharged as medically unfit.
Now, I'm going to play a part now. I'm going to be Alderman Pohl. Now, you might think, that's a familiar name. Is he the father of Alan Ball, the world-famous footballer? No! He's not. He's the father of Albert Ball,
who you have described in at least one of your books as Alan Ball.
Yes, I have. I'm not that good, am I? Yeah, so here's Alderman Ball. You sound fit enough to me.
Oh, it ain't my voice, it's my heart.
Why don't you enlist again?
Well, they won't pass me, and besides, I reckon I've done my share. I think it's everybody's duty to go. You gentlemen, at which point he pointed to the magistrates, you ought to go. It's you people who look upon us as dirty dogs that we have to go and fight for. I think it's your place to list. I've done my bit.
Well, you can imagine, people reading that, think, oh, the good old honest, salt of the earth ex-Tommy, sticking it to the man. God bless him. Yeah, you tell him. And actually, that story was picked up in a book that was produced during the centenary about Nottingham in the Great War. And I thought, yeah, he's an interesting character. I'd come across him a couple of times before. And then you go, yeah, right. By 1913, when he's in court, the magistrates say he's got 30 previous convictions. And then you look at his army service record, and he wasn't kicked out of the army with a bad art, but with a bad character. He'd been done 7 times for various offences, including, amazingly enough, disobedience and insubordination, and drunkenness. Gary. In fact, he knew damn well that he wouldn't get in the army with his record, which is why when he joined up, he used his mother's maiden name, because the army actually would have checked. But his, shall we say, misdemeanours in the army were nothing compared to one of his previous offences. Because on the night of Saturday, the 20th of October 1906, he grabbed hold of a 14-year-old girl called Annie Wells, and he dragged her into a yard. Now, what happened was interrupted because Annie Wells was heard to shout, Don't, I'm only just turned 14. I've only just left school. Now, some of the people in the area heard this, interrupted, and Belshaw slunk away. Now, unfortunately, what he'd done, he'd kicked her in the process, and the injury that she got there developed into an abscess. That abscess became infected, and after a month, she died in the workhouse hospital. So the coroner's inquest looked at what was happening to ascribe what was the reason for her death. And I think, Gary, you've got something from that report.
Yeah, the report of the trial, which was held on the 6th of March 1907, said this. When the girl was clearly in a dying condition, the proper formalities were observed to enable her depositions to be taken. And in her deposition, she said that the prisoner dragged her into a court, twice committed an offence on her, and afterwards kicked her.
I mean, an offence. I mean, he wasn't charged with a sexual assault, but an offence, and bearing in mind what Annie Wells said, don't, I'm only just turned 14, doesn't really leave too much to the imagination.
No.
Now, the coroner's jury convicts him of willful murder. They decide that the injury she sustained was the direct cause of her death and that he had caused that injury. Now, when he went to trial, he was found guilty of lesser charge of manslaughter. But this cheeky chappie telling it to Albert Ball's dad is not quite such a delightful character as that report make him appear. In fact, he carried on, as soon as he was out of the army, he carried on adding to his list of offences.
So it's not a one-off?
No. He says he's got a list.
Attacking women.
He's got dozens of offences, largely attacking women, headbutting police officers, you name it. But frequently, all too frequently, he's attacking and abusing women. The police officers he attacks are the ones who are trying to stop him attacking or threatening women. He gets done on Boxing Day in 1925, and he attacks another woman called Maud Presswood. And John Ashworth, Major John Ashworth of the Robin Hoods, who actually was from Ruddington, Peter, where we, of course, first met.
That is where we first met, and I think we drank. It was after a WFA meeting. You were then chair of the branch, and I think we managed to drink 4 pints. You remember, in about 3/4 of an hour.
Yeah, Tim Taylor's landlord, the 3 Crowns pub in Ruddington. They haven't got a plaque up yet, but it's surely a matter of time.
I feel like Princess Diana, the third one in this marriage. Oh, it sounds so lovely how you two met.
Oh, it was romantical. Anyway, I'm now going to be Major John Ashworth. He was Sherwood Foresters, was he? Anyway, he says, you have a shocking record. I wish there was a law passed to do away with such men as you, to put you on an island where you could be kept away from everybody. You are not fit to be at large. You are an absolute disgrace to your country. A man like you ought to be dealt with more severely, and I should like to have the opportunity of dealing with you.
Answers on a postcard for what that was.
Not quite sure what he meant there.
Well, he gets bound over for 6 months on that one, and then
he doesn't get jail or anything.
He doesn't get jail time for that. No.
I mean, that's quite a severe speech to have given, to then give somebody 6 months being bound over.
Well, there's one report when it says one of the reports, he gets the usual 3 months, and it's almost as if they think, well, prison is just, there's almost no point because it don't work. This guy doesn't respond. But he didn't appear in court again for another 8 years, and a point he made when he appeared for the last time, as far as I can tell, in court in 1935, and he'd been to see his local team, Notts County, play in the FA Cup at the Might of Grantham, from what I can tell. So, Gary, what did Belshaw say after that, then?
He says, Frank Belshaw, I have followed Notts since I was a little boy of 8, and I felt that I must see them qualify at Grantham for the Cup. I want you to deal with me as leniently as you can. I've only been once before the magistrates in 11 years.
Several dozens times beforehand, but only once in 11 years.
Yes, not a nice man.
Man of good character.
Yeah, so heroes all, of course, but I'm not sure about him. And perhaps that's what people should be thinking of as they listen to this. Don't mouth platitudes. Think about the men you're talking about. That's all the time. That's what we're going. I don't think his war service had any impact on his character or behaviour. Do you, lads?
No.
I mean, he had a habit of fighting bare-chested with other men, so he wasn't all bad.
Not sure he looked like Brad Pitt or something like that, but
right. Well, let's have a look at someone else. Perhaps this will be a hero. This will be a true hero. This will be someone you can look up to, stand next to in the street, and say, "This truly was a man." Frank Carroll. Tell us about him, Jim?
Frank Carroll lived round about, 400 yards away from where I'm speaking now, in the ever-delightful Hucknall. He was a coal miner. He was born in 1885.
Doesn't have any relatives still living, does he? before we do this.
I'll probably at school with them, you never know.
Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
It's okay.
Just concerned for your safety.
Oh.
Yeah, perhaps we should talk about people from Derby, Jim, or somewhere like that.
Oh, I'm known there as well, don't matter.
Oh. Sorry.
That's okay.
So where was he born? 1885.
He was born in
Hucknall.
Born in 1885 into a mining family, and he follows his dad down the pit. There were plenty around here at the time. And he got married to his wife Elizabeth in 1906, and they had 2 children.
It's all going well so far.
Yeah, it's all seems well. So he joins up in October 1914, and he goes into the 11th Battalion, the Sherwood Foresters.
Fine body of men.
Yeah, well, there was one bloke who got beaten up so badly in a pub in Nottingham that he was discharged and never saw frontline service, so he probably should have bought a pint to the bloke who broke his leg for him.
Yes.
Anyway, so he goes over the 11th Foresters. They don't go to France till August 15. Now, he's wounded within a matter of weeks after that, and he's invalided back to the UK. After he's recuperated, he's not wounded that severely, he goes back out to France again the following March. So it's not a minor wound, he's been out for months, but he goes back, and he's one of the men standing in the line on the 1st of July 1916.
So this is going to be an actual account provided by Frank Carroll of the first...
Yeah, this is what Frank Carroll, this is part of his testimony of what he saw that day. And obviously the 11th Battalion, well, they weren't in the first line, they were in the second wave.
So Frank Carroll, at 9 o'clock our time had come. We'd waited, the waiting, and we were in a hurry to get over. At last the words came, "Sherwood, over!" We were soon over, but not a man out of my platoon got over 60 yards. Nothing could live in it. We were enfiladed by machine gun fire from both sides, also on our front. I think I was the last one on my pins in our lot. I got one in the right elbow, and I went down close to one of our officers, who had the calf of his leg blown away. I crawled into a shell hole, then decided to be dead for a few hours. After 4 hours, things began to steady down a little, so I crawled out of my shell hole. But when I'd gone a few yards, I had to give up. I was weak through loss of blood. After a time, I thought I would risk it, so I got up and walked the rest of the way.
Now, this sounds like he's a reasonably... It's a fairly standard brave soldier in action story, this. Would you agree, Jim?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the army obviously rated him. I mean, eventually he made sergeant.
So this is not a completely useless article like the first chap we dealt with.
Clearly not. He must have been regarded as a competent soldier and a brave one.
Is that the last time he's wounded?
No, he gets wounded for the 3rd time. And whilst he's recuperating in 1917 from those wounds, a piece is run about him in the local newspaper, and he is a thrice wounded hero. And so it's a big piece celebrating this man's brave conduct, from which I've taken that quotation of his from the 1st July. But the same newspaper reports another side of him when he's back on home leave in June of 1918. The same newspaper carried this report.
Now, this is, there's no humour in this. This is a horrible report, isn't it? Gary, you're going to read it.
Yeah, this is from that newspaper report. He'd been wounded in action on 3 occasions, and each time, when convalescent, he came home to his wife at Hucknall and thrashed her. Last month he came home on leave, and on June the 11th entered her bedroom in a half-drunken condition. He locked the door, pulled a razor out of his pocket, and holding it in the air like a bayonet, told her to make her will, as she was going to be killed. She asked him why he wished to kill her, and he replied that he was tired of her. He next kicked her and nearly strangled her. She was on the borders of unconsciousness, and to act as a reviver, he forced water into her mouth. When she came round, He gave her a thrashing and finally kicked her downstairs. She screamed, and the children also made a noise, which attracted the attention of neighbours, who broke into the house. She was so exhausted as to necessitate being carried to her mother's house.
Now, this is quite cold-blooded in places, the reviving her and this isn't a backhander. This is a sustained violent assault. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And the fact that the neighbours actually physically broke into the house to stop it. I mean, this isn't a noisy row. As you say, this is a sustained assault. This is where he, as evidence of his attitude to his wife, a letter that he sent to her from France was read out in court.
Now, this is Frank Carroll's letter. Charming letter. You say that you are short of money. Well, you know how to make a bit. What love I had for you is now killed. I neither want to see you or hear your name again. Our ways are apart. There is nothing I want to return for. How do you think he was suggesting she made money in that then, lads?
Well, taking in washing?
It's an unpleasant letter, and he seems to have become or was an unpleasant man. What happened? So, does Elizabeth Carroll stay with him?
No. That court hearing wasn't what was more than just the assault. The assault was evidence of her seeking what's called a separation order. So it's a maintenance order. She wants legal separation from her husband, but for him to pay towards her upkeep. Now, naturally, he doesn't pay a penny. He refuses, and he comes in court again. And it's later revealed that she'd actually left him in 1911 because of his previous abuse. So this is another man with an established pattern of behaviour, which might have been exacerbated by what happened in 1418, but it wasn't created by what happened during those times. I've got quite a lot of respect for Elizabeth Carroll. I mean, she actually manages to get a divorce in December 1921. Now, for a working class woman to get a divorce in those days is quite an achievement. It costs a lot of money.
I think she was probably more of a hero than he was.
I think so, yes.
In some ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let's go on to move to our next one. The next one is an unusual one, in my view. It's Frederick Carter. Tell us the background to this one, Jim.
Yeah, Frederick Carter's born in Nottingham in 1893 and orphaned.
Jim, have you considered getting a job for the Nottingham Tourist Board?
Funnily enough...
You're doing them the power of good.
Axe murderers, wife beaters.
Hey.
No poisoners.
Well, Nottingham was known in the 90s as Shottingham, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Jim. So, born again in Nottingham.
Yeah,
again.
Well, Nottingham's a foreign land to me anyway, so... Anyway, so he was born in Notts in 1893. Both his parents die whilst he's still a very young child, so he's brought up at Bagthorpe Workhouse, which is where I was born, actually, when it became the City Hospital.
Oh.
So in 1914, he's working at Gedling Colliery. Now, I wasn't born in the workhouse, but hey. And he was lodging with the 74-year-old widow of a policeman in 1914. And
I thought she was 80.
She was later on. She made
you
it to
tricked me. So I do apologise.
No, it's okay. So he didn't volunteer when war became... He's a minor, it's an essential job anyway. But he did a test under the Derby scheme. So
what does that mean, Jim? I've made a note of that. I'm not sure what that means under the Derby scheme.
The Derby scheme was like the last kicks of the volunteer system before the introduction of conscription, to give it a last chance where everybody was invited to come forward and attest their willingness to serve in the military or the navy, and then to go back home and to be called up in their order, to be placed in various classes based on their age, and then they'd be able to appeal if there were personal circumstances. But a man like Frederick Carter is down the pit. Well, he's doing a pretty essential job. So he isn't mobilised. He is in May 1918. Of course, we've got a bit of a manpower crisis by that stage.
They're desperate by then.
Yeah. So he's combed out, as they were calling it. His military service in the front line lasts about a day, or less than a day. He joins the 7th Battalion Lincolnshire Regiment, northeast of Amiens on the 20th of August 1918. The area is subject to gas shelling. He gets a dose. He's out the line. That's it. That's his frontline military service. He's demobilised and goes back to lodge with Harriet Shawcroft.
How old is she then?
I think she's around about 80 by then, Peter. It's this time passing thing. It's just weird.
The
gassing clearly affected him physically, and he really wasn't. It appears he wasn't up to the physical challenge of working as a coal miner anymore. Now he leaves that job. He gets another job, but that doesn't seem to last either. Then 6 o'clock on the evening of the 12th of July 1919, he's seen chopping firewood, chopping sticks in the backyard. Harriet Shawcroft, who is on very good terms with, everybody agrees. She's been seen a couple of hours earlier. Then Carter, next time he's seen, is 8 o'clock that night when he goes into a local pub, the Freeman's Arms in St Anne's. And he has about an hour in there with a drinking acquaintance of his called Charles Miller. Now, eventually, the bar staff think this Carter's behaviour is a bit strange. And they think, you've had enough, I'm not serving you anymore. The expression in the report is that Carter abuses the barmaid. And he leaves with Miller. Then outside the pub, Carter wants to carry on drinking. Miller doesn't. So Carter thumps him. And then he just wanders off where we don't know. The next time he's seen is when he bumps into two women that he knows in the street, not ladies of the street, at 10 o'clock that night. And I believe, Peter, you are those
yes,
women.
I'm going to chide him gently. I'm going to try and do the accent. This is a murder, so it shouldn't really be funny, but I can't help it. I'm going to try and do a girl's accent. Get home! Get off home, Mrs. Shawcroft. We'll be waiting for you.
Mrs. Shawcroft will be no more.
Get off! You're telling lies!
Mrs. Shawcroft is lying in a pool of blood.
Well, whether or not those women believed him or not, don't know, but he wanders off, and he ends up banging on the doors of the Guildhall in Nottingham, which those days was the headquarters of the police. Sergeant Samuel Good is on duty there and sees Carter, and he says to him, "What are you knocking about here for?"
"I want a night's lodging. I've nowhere to go."
"Where do you belong to?"
"Nottingham."
"Why don't you go to your lodgings?"
"I can't. My landlady is dead."
"How long's she been dead?"
"She died tonight. I've killed her. It's a fact. There's no use denying it. I killed her. Her name is Mrs. Shawcroft. I've had a drink or two. It's a shame the old lady is done in." At which point he threw £1 onto the desk and said, "Get a drink. It'll be of no use to me now. I took it out of the landlady's pocket when I done it."
Right, well, Police Sergeant Good described Carter at that time as calm, rational and sober. So Good gets in touch with whoever he needs to, and the police go round to the house.
Now, I'm playing the part of Dr. Taylor, the police surgeon. He's the man who goes and investigates the scene. And he says, and this isn't funny at all, this is horrible, she'd been subjected to violent and frenzied blows with a heavy, sharp instrument. Rigor mortis had set in, so that death must have occurred 6 or 7 hours previously. The face was fearfully disfigured and scarcely recognisable. Across the forehead there was a large, lacerated, gaping wound, 6.5 inches in length, the bone immediately beneath being fractured and the brain substance being penetrated. A second blow had fractured the bones of the cheek and the lower jaw. Altogether there had been 4 separate chops, and death must have been instantaneous. And they found the weapon, didn't they, Jim?
Yeah. He'd hung it up in the normal place, the difference being that it was covered in Mrs. Shawcroft's blood and hair.
And what was it?
It was a hatchet. It was the hatchet he'd been seen to use chopping wood earlier in the yard. So it's a small axe. And he's taken an axe to her. It appeared that she was sitting downstairs reading the evening paper at the time, and he just hit her. Why?
So we don't know, do we?
No, absolutely not. He never explained, and no one could account for it. So
what about the trial? What happens at the trial?
Well, he appears, obviously charged with murder on the 11th of November 1919. It was the first anniversary of the armistice.
Fitting.
And indeed, the trial straddles 11 o'clock. So they pause the trial, and Carter stands between two prison warders for the 2-minute silence. And at the court, and then he's found guilty and sentenced to death. There is no evidence at all of motive. Everyone said that she was, in a good relationship with the woman that he killed. Some of the witnesses said, yeah, he'd been quiet occasionally, sometimes brooding was the word used. But what wasn't in doubt was what he'd done. He'd taken an axe to the head of an 80-year-old woman who apparently he was friendly with.
Now, the judge sums it up, and I know Gary's looked this up, so I'll read what the judge says, and then, Gary, you want to make a few comments about what this is. And the judge says this: before a man could escape the responsibility of his actions, it must either be proved either that he did not know what he was doing, or, if he did know, that he did not know it was wrong. It was not sufficient to plead that his actions were difficult to explain, or that to commit a murder there must be a powerful motive. Now, this follows on a famous judgment, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's called the Mcnaughton Rule, and it was used for some considerable time, and it was a test of insanity, and it was named after Daniel Mcnaughton, who tried to kill Sir Robert Peel in 1843 when he was Prime Minister. And in fact, he tried to shoot him. He missed him, but killed his secretary. And he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, not because he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. He did, but he didn't know what he was doing. He had no idea that he'd committed this offence, as it were. And that was used for some considerable time, right into the 20th century. That was used as the test for insanity. And that's what the judge is referring to when he's saying you either don't know what you're doing, or if you do know, you don't know it's wrong. And that was used consistently in all trials right through to the 20th century.
But the point is that he is sentenced to death as a result. And now what happens then?
Well, the jury had made no recommendation for mercy, but his defence team did immediately lodge an appeal on the grounds of insanity. They got a petition together to appeal for public to sign on his behalf, but the Home Office doctors actually assessed Carter's condition, and they agreed that he definitely was not responsible for his actions. He was, in quotes, insane. So therefore he's committed to Broadmoor for the rest of his days, and his death sentence is commuted.
Now, how do you feel about this? I say I'm not getting the sense of this chap's an evildoer. I'm not sure whether his army service triggers something, or whether he's mad, or what's going on. But this doesn't seem an open and shut case as to a hero's all or not.
No.
I'm not sure.
No, I mean, it's hard to say that this man suffered from prolonged military service or shell shock or whatever. They did question whether or not his gassing could have affected his mental state. The opinion was, well, it can upset people, but it doesn't predispose people to act in the manner in which he did. Clearly in the case, in the trial they did go into this, but really it became a mystery. What isn't reported is what the Home Office assessment was, but they clearly felt that the man was not responsible for his actions.
And did they reach that decision, Jim, before the petition was actually finished? So the doctors reached that ahead of that? They
did. I mean, they were collecting nearly 1,000 signatures, but that wasn't submitted to the authorities because they'd already concluded. They'd set his execution date for the 2nd of December 1919. So, I suppose if they were going to act, they're going to have to act quickly. They did, and they decided that he wasn't responsible for his actions, which obviously is not what the conclusion of the jury in the trial was. But,
and did he die in Broadmoor, Jim?
To the best of my knowledge, he did. He vanishes from normal public records, and I haven't got access to Broadmoor's. But yeah, I'd be very surprised if he emerged out of that establishment.
So our next one, another one, William Herbert, and this will be familiar to most of us.
Hang on, he's from London. What's going on?
Yes.
Well, don't worry. There is a connection to Nottingham,
excellent.
the crime capital of the planet. William Hubert.
This is more familiar to me as a standard story from the military across the ages. Can you tell us what happened, Sir Jim?
Yeah, he's a Londoner born in 1879, a marine donkeyman when he joins up.
Hang on. A marine donkey. Now, I thought, does that mean underwater donkeys?
Yeah. So
I went off and thought, what's a marine donkeyman? So I've looked it up. It's a merchant navy role invented in 1881. And what he was responsible for was something called the donkey engine, which was a sort of steam-powered winch, which was much more disappointing than the vision I had of donkeys in underwater helmets.
You were. Your whole day was sport, as I remember.
It was, yeah. But I love the term. I'm a marine donkeyman, don't you know?
You are a donkeyman, yes.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry for that interruption.
No, it's okay. Anyway, when he signs on the 4th of September 1914, he says he's been in the Royal Naval Reserve for 17 years. I can't find a naval record for that.
And marine donkeyman is a merchant navy role.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there's plenty of ex-navy guys in the merchant service, but yes. I can't find a record. But
all the nice girls like a sailor, apparently.
Quite possibly.
You wanted to join the navy, didn't you?
I did, yes.
And on that note, right, so what happens to him? He joins up in Glamorgan in Wales.
Yeah, he joins the 11th Battalion Rifle Brigade, progresses through the ranks. He's acting sergeant by February 1915.
Oh, he's doing well.
Yeah. He gets
better than you.
He gets very, very drunk on the 25th of April 1915, and he's severely admonished, but he still progresses to promotion to sergeant on the 22nd of June. And a month later, they're in France. He goes to France with his battalion. As far as I can tell, serves perfectly well. There's nothing in the records to suggest anything otherwise. Until on the 15th of May 1916, he's behind the line and he's found drunk. And he's tried a week later and reduced to the rank of corporal.
Can we surmise that when he has a binge, that he gets well and truly drunk, not a few beers and a little bit staggery? For the army to take that action, there's normally quite a serious amount of drunkenness going on.
Yeah.
Would you agree, lads?
Absolutely.
No.
You're keeping quiet.
I know why. Very quiet at this point.
How many times were you done for drunkenness in the army, Gary?
I'd say to people I was a sergeant because I had 3 stripes, just not necessarily at the same time.
Right. Having moved on from your glorious career. So he's reduced to the rank of corporal, and then he's in trouble again in July 16, isn't he?
He is, yeah. And his company commander, Captain Jess Davis of the 11th Rifle Brigade, has this to say. He says, I'd sent in a charge against Corporal Hubert on July 10th, 1916, of refusing to obey an order. The order had been given by Sergeant Whitfield and Corporal Fox, and they were the chief witnesses against him. Corporal Hubert had been my transport sergeant and had been reduced for drunkenness last May. Now, what happened next was witnessed by Corporal Edward Scott.
Yeah, and I'm going to read that one. So Corporal Edward Scott said, between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m., July the 11th, 1916, I came out of my hut to go to the latrines, and as I came out, I heard a rifle shot. Very soon afterwards, I heard a second report, and a door slammed, and I saw Corporal Hubert running towards me. And as he was running, he was looking back over his shoulder. Directly he looked to his front again, he saw me, and putting the muzzle to his head, fired the rifle and fell down. I went straight up to him and found he had shot himself through the cheek and was dead.
And Captain Jess Davis says, I went out and inspected the hut and found Sergeant Whitfield dead in his bunk, shot through the head. Acting Corporal Fox was also dead in his bunk, shot through the chest. About 40 yards away, in the wagon lines, Corporal Hubert was lying dead, shot through the mouth. So,
now this is, he'd shot the 2 people who'd done for him, who'd lost him his promotion. So we don't know his motivation. You can surmise reasonably enough he may well have been drunk again, and he may well have lost his temper with these two people. They may well have not. They may have been picking on him. They clearly had issues, these people, and he shot them. Is this unusual in the military? I think the answer to that, to answer my own question, is yes. But is it very unusual?
It's not unheard of.
It's not unheard of. That's a much better description.
Yeah. And they're all buried in Flamerting Military Cemetery, aren't they? Which is between Ypres and Poppering, isn't it? On the main Ypres Poppering Road.
Have you any?
Okay, they're not in adjacent plots though, so.
But
that would be too ironic. What do you think of this one, Jim? Well, I mean, you picked him, not picked him, but you drew him to our attention. What do you think of this case?
Well, as you say, it's difficult to say because the two men he killed might have been making his life a hell. I mean, we don't know. There's nothing there to suggest what happened. Quite clearly, yes, he's not going to think well of people if he blames them for his own demotion, even if he got drunk. He was responsible for getting drunk himself. But it's a tough one. At the end of the day, this guy just gets up in the early hours of the morning, whether he'd been drinking and brewing all night, I don't know, walks into the two huts and shoots the two men whilst they're asleep.
It's a bit harsh.
A bit harsh? I mean, the bottom line is these people have access, because they're soldiers, to weapons. And on another day, he might have just gone and had a punch-up with them if there were no weapons available. Compared to some of the things we're seeing, it's almost... You accept this easier, I think, is how I would describe it. We're all accepting of this, it's not unheard of. It's happened, And arguably, there's probably less about this than there are some of the others, because presumably there was no trial. Were the relatives told Jim the truth, do you know? Or were they just recorded as lost in action?
No, all the pension records do say shot by comrade for the two men. And
that's interesting. They were honest about it.
Yeah, and the two and the man himself, it's self-inflicted wounds, and it quite clearly says after killing two of his comrades.
It's a sad case, though. It's sad for the two chaps who were killed, but they may have been bullying. We don't know, so we can't really draw any conclusions whatsoever, and we won't. The next one is I'm going to deal with. It's someone that I found out about. This is William Podmore, and it almost follows on from the last one. It's because I know about this case from a Private William Holbrook, one of the very first I interviewed. He was 4th Royal Fusilier. He was at Mons, as you read from my book Fire and Movement. That's the advertising for today. Will have noticed that he was in there. And he was a wonderful veteran that I interviewed. And he told me a story. And what this story is, it illustrates the hurly-burly of military life. It shows how you do get these personal, vicious enmities that can be based on real or imagined grievances, and they can go a variety of ways. What I want you to notice about this is that Private William Podmore does not seem to have been a nice man. You'll also notice that William Holbrook assaults him violently with no warning. Probably the best way to assault someone who's a big, violent man, but never mind. Do you see what I mean? He doesn't shoot him now, does he? So this is William Holbrook. This is going to be you, Gary. Could you do it in a London accent, please? He came from Essex.
Can you do it in a London accent? He came from Essex.
Essex, bit of London.
Private William Holbrook.
Brilliant.
Fusiliers. I was very friendly with Grant, who was a conscript. He came in from Hitchin, and his father was a builder. He was about my age and very small. Another fellow in my company was named Podmore. He was a burly, gloating sort of a big head. I never did like him. He never liked me. I always felt as though I could put my fist in his face. He was always getting on to Grant. You bloody conscript. Whenever he could, he insulted him. One day we were in a Nissen hut and we'd got a brazier. The fellows were standing round it, about half a dozen, and the others were scattered about the hut. Young Grant was there near me, and Podmore started getting on to him. Bloody conscript, all that. I said, why don't you leave him alone and get on to someone your own size? He said, what's it got to do with you? I'd got an old French coffee pot on top of this brazier. He picked this up and shoved it right on top of my head. The grouts, all that burning coffee. It ran down my neck. God blimey, I was so mad. I hit him and knocked him the length of the Nissen hut. He skidded along the polished floor. I chased after him, and before he could get up, I got his head between my hands. I know I'd have killed him. I was hitting his head on the bare boards, and they pulled me off. You see, my finger, that's what I got from hitting Podmore. It's never got straight. I could never do anything with it. All those years, so I must have hit him pretty hard.
Well, you could see how that could have been a murder case as well, bashing someone's head against floorboards. I'd forgotten about the coffee being thrown over him, funnily enough, so that's more of an excuse. But you could see this is personal. Now, the reason I did this was because it was drawn to my attention by Holbrook that Podmore came to a sorry end. So I looked him up. And in the pre-internet years, you couldn't do any of this, could you, Jim? It was impossible. No. Gary, you just couldn't do it. But now you could. And Holbrook had read in the newspaper that Podmore had been tried for murder. And so I looked it up. And in January 1929, the sort of rotting corpse of a chap called Vivian Messiter, who was the proprietor of the Wolf's Head Oil Company, and he'd been found behind some boxes in a lock-up garage. Now during the war, Mester, he was an officer with the Northumberland Fusiliers, and now he'd been found, and his skull was smashed to bits. Several repeated brutal blows, and there was a blood-stained hammer nearby. Now, when they were investigating, they found out Podmore had been employed as one of his oil company salesmen. And what's more, had been illicitly claiming commission on sales to non-existent customers. Fraud. So he'd been committing fraud on Mester. And the speculation at the time was that Mester had discovered this fraud and confronted Podmore. And Podmore had hepped up with a hammer and murdered him. Now, when I read the reports of this, I have to say, it's one of those ones where you think, he probably did it, but you wouldn't be found guilty for it now, not with the evidence. The evidence was circumstantial, to my mind. But he was convicted, and he was duly hung at Winchester Prison on 22nd of April 1930. Now, this could have been a miscarriage of justice. I think it probably wasn't. It just shows the way, and this will become relevant later perhaps, the way people used to get hung because they were the most likely suspect. But I found this interesting. They weren't all heroes. This Podmore is an unpleasant character, a bully, and it proved after the war a murderer. Did he become a murderer because of his wartime experiences? Or do you just think he was a bad lot?
Well, he didn't become a bully because of his wartime experiences. Holbrook clearly describes him as that during the army. So, he may well have done, but equally, he may well have killed him to cover up the fact that he was committing a fraud.
I think the main lesson is just don't parrot heroes all. Have a think about the case. Make your own mind up before you parrot something. Parroting.
How about heroes some?
Or heroes few?
Yeah, or
I think most
heroes.
of them. No, I'm not.
Let's just have heroes.
Let's just think about each case and not try and make one size fit all. Now, the next case was the one I think that first attracted me to Jim's collection of murderers and famous Nottingham individuals. And this is Thomas Pohl. Tell me about this appalling case.
I first knew about this case because the man's medals used to be on display in a shop in Nottingham that I occasionally used to visit. And
was it a special shop? Hang on, was it a sort of special shop?
Yeah, and his two nephews asked me. They knew the basic background, but they asked me if trace a bit more. This is long time ago, before the internet as well. Anyway, so Thomas Pohl was born in Nottingham, in Hyson Green, it's called, 20th of January 1889. He, like a lot of other people, worked down a local colliery. And he got married in 1910. He married a woman called Frances Foster, and they lived in Nottingham, which is just outside the city limits.
Carlton.
Yeah. He joined up very early in the war and joined the 9th Battalion Sherwood Foresters, the senior Kitchener Battalion. But before he goes away, he speaks to the local police inspector, a guy called James Harrop. One of Harrop's sons was in the same battalion, as a matter of fact. And he asks him to keep an eye on his wife.
Now, he's got 2 kids at the time. Is he asking him to keep an eye out of them for their welfare, or is he suspicious of his wife's conduct?
It appears that
do we not know?
It appears that he was suspicious of his wife's conduct because that's the context in which he actually later speaks to Harrop and asks him, "Didn't I ask you to keep an eye on my wife?"
Right, so, thank you. I just wanted to, because in view of what happens, this is a very sad case. Carry on. So what happens next?
Yeah, so he goes to Gallipoli, survives that, goes to the Somme, and he's wounded there, and in fact he's wounded twice. Now, there are contradictory reports of how many times or for how long he came home after he was wounded on the Western Front. The key thing about
this is relevant. This is relevant.
Yes, this is very relevant because on the 21st of February 1917, his wife gives birth to a baby girl. And he clearly is not the father. The confusion comes because it seems that he was on leave, or at least on recuperation, round about January 1917. And there is a mark on his record that he deserted around this time. So there's something going off, but his actual detailed record doesn't survive. But his wife later says that he didn't know that she'd given birth. Well, if he'd been home when she's 7 or 8 months pregnant, I think he would have noticed.
But hadn't she moved out of the family home by then?
She had moved out of the family home. She'd sold his home. She said that she was desperate for cash. She'd sold the home and she'd moved back with her parents. So he's back on the Western Front.
So this is would it be fair to say this is a not throwing blame at either party? This is at the moment anyway. This is a dysfunctional marriage.
It would, yeah. Well, I think asking a policeman to keep an eye on your wife is a pretty good hint that all's not well. So back on the Western Front, he's still with the 9th Battalion despite being wounded. Sometimes they're posted to other units, as you know, like my own grandfather. And on the 4th of October 1917, he is awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his conduct that day. And the words of his official citation are, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He was one of the leading wave in an attack which was held up by parties of the enemy. He rushed forward with his officer against a machine gun, put the team to flight, and captured the gun. His courageous action undoubtedly saved the lives of many of his comrades."
Brave chap.
Absolutely, clearly a brave chap, putting a machine gun team to flight. So he's.
And this was at 3rd Ep.
This is 3rd Ep. So you can imagine that it's not under the happiest of conditions altogether.
No.
Anyway, so he does. One date absolutely is fixed. He comes home on leave on the 29th of January 1918, and his wife is holding her 11-month-old daughter, Evelyn Foster Pohl. Now, by all accounts, he's understanding, he's accepting of the situation, and in the reports of the time, he resumes cohabitation with his wife. On the 12th of February 1918, the last day of his leave, he tells his wife to nip out and get him some cigarettes. And then he tells his 7-year-old sister-in-law, Mary, to go in the street and play. Well, Mary goes out, knocks around a bit. When she comes back, the house appears to be empty. There's no Thomas Pohl. Her elder sister is round at her sister-in-law's, and she looks for the baby. She finds the child floating face down in a tub of water in the yard at the rear of the house. And then she rushes out to find her elder sister, Frances, the mother of the child. And Nellie Foster, her sister-in-law, described what happened.
Nellie Foster. My sister-in-law went to the tub which was in the yard of 72 Dow Road, Carlton. The chair bottom was on top of the dolly tub. My sister lifted it off and took the child out of the tub, and I took the child from her and took its clothes off. I tried to revive it, but it was dead. It was my sister-in-law's child. The dolly tub was under the rain spout and was full of rainwater. I placed the child on the dresser in the front room.
Well, you can imagine, so they fetch the police, and who comes round? It is Inspector James Harrop, the policeman that Thomas Pohl had asked to keep an eye on his wife. And this is what he said. I saw there the dead body of a female child of about 12 months old on a dresser in the front room. It was quite dead and naked. I went in search of the prisoner, and at 5 p.m. that day, I saw him at 12 Dunstan Street, Carlton, at the house of his father. Deputy Chief Constable Harrop and Detective Sergeant Hames were with me. The prisoner's mother was present and said, "Whatever have you been doing?" Prisoner, Thomas Pohl, replied, "It's not for being an absentee. I've drowned that kid." I then cautioned the prisoner and said, "I charge you with the wilful murder of Evelyn Foster Pohl, daughter of your wife, by drowning it in a dolly tub at 72 Dale Road, Carlton, at about 2 o'clock this afternoon." He replied, "Well, I've done it, and if I'd done right, I should have drowned my wife as well. I could soon have done her. It would have not taken 2 minutes. But I thought about her father and mother. I was sorry for them." Now, that statement is read out at the coroner's inquest, and Pohl says it's quite right what the inspector said. He made no attempt to deny or make any plea in mitigation.
So he then...
Sorry, Peter. I was going to say, it was an interest to me, Jim, that the Deputy Chief Constable is also called Harrop.
It's a police family.
So the whole family, they'd all risen well in the local constabulary.
Yeah, they'd been in different parts of Notts. They'd even been to Hucknall and survived that. So...
Sorry, Peter, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, what happened when he appeared in court then? So he appears in court on, 26th of June, 1918? What happens?
Well, he's charged with murder, and his defence counsel summed up and was seeking to shift the blame to the real father of the baby. And
now, this is the common thing that's happening at this time, isn't it? It's the wife's partner with the illicit baby that's at fault, not the husband.
Yeah. So the defence counsel summing up consisted of, if justice were done, there ought to be a more sinister figure side by side with him in the dock, the man through whose shameful acts this case has arisen. I ask you, in coming to any verdict, to accompany it with the strongest possible recommendation to mercy. Now, if you think about it, whether the other person had been in the dock with him or otherwise, it didn't negate his crime one iota.
No,
and yet that's what his defence counsel decided to sum up with.
But it works, doesn't it, Jim? It
does work. I mean, there was a case the previous autumn in Bristol when they absolutely categorically said that the father of a soldier's wife's illegitimate child was the guilty party, the sole responsible person. And they actually acquitted a man who shot and killed his pregnant wife on Bristol Temple Mead Station on that precise offence.
And what happens with Pohl then after that summing up?
Well, Pohl is indeed sentenced to death. He's found guilty, sentenced to death, but with the strongest possible recommendation to mercy. As you can imagine, this is quite a story in the Nottingham area, and an 18,000 name petition was got up for clemency for his case. And indeed, his sentence was commuted to one of penal servitude for life.
And he's divorced, isn't he? I mean, this is a ludicrous... I found that quite strange. I was reading the notes you sent us. He was allowed out of Maidstone Prison in November 22 and to instigate divorce proceedings against his wife.
Indeed. I mean, the magistrate in that case is saying, well, how long is he in prison for? And life. What for? They don't say. Oh, no, not say. But well, no, he's not applying for custody of the children. Well, he wouldn't, would he? No, he's a lifer. But his divorce is granted on the grounds of his wife's misconduct. He doesn't serve much longer, does he? No, he's out in 1925. He served 7 years. And according to what I can tell, one of the first things he does is he applies for his Distinguished Conduct Medal and his campaign medals, his 14, 15 Star War Medal and Victory Medal, which he forfeited on conviction, and they granted him.
And what happens to him in the end, then?
Well, the last time he appears in a record, he's in 1939. He's working at the Royal Ordnance Factory as a gun boring machine attendant, and lived until he was 72.
How do we feel about this one, then? It's an appalling crime.
It is an appalling crime, and I'm struggling with the concept that, it's almost premeditated. It's almost like he's gone home, I'm going to sit here till the end of my leave, and then I'm going to kill the baby. And the fact that 18,000 people signed a petition for clemency, and he was, it would seem, treated leniently by the system. You mentioned, Pete, he only served 7 years. I'm absolutely astounded. Yeah, I find it astonishing.
How does his family feel about him, Jim?
Well,
ambivalent, I would imagine.
The two that I knew were ambivalent, but some others did contact on the Facebook page, and I'd not made any judgments. I'd merely reproduced the court record, as reported, which were pretty full reports in those days. As far as they were concerned, he was a hero suffering from shell shock, and they were all lies that were told about him. This woman had done terrible thing to him. She'd sold his house. She'd been unfaithful to him, and he was a hero. Absolutely maintained he was a hero. I'm not so sure. Throughout all the process, the man was absolutely under control. He did not appear to be acting out of temper, as Gary said. This man seems to have made his mind up what he was doing. He engineered the situation which left him alone in that house with that 11-month-old baby, and he did what he did. Never tried to deny it, and he never showed any remorse or made any apology, at least that I could actually find in any report.
And I wouldn't condone any violence against any of the parties, but that baby was completely innocent of anything. If he had a grievance against his wife for selling the house, or a grievance against his wife for, having intimate relations with another man, that's not the baby's fault.
No.
None of that's the baby's fault.
And I think that's one thing no one can get round. Because when somebody did comment saying, oh, well, he was a hero, blah, blah, oh, P.S., oh, yeah, well, he shouldn't have killed a baby. Well, you can't just sweep that to one side, can you?
That's the centre of it, isn't it? Well, let's move to our last one. The last one is just going for... Let's finish on a high. Let's finish on the worst of the lot, and that's John Christie. We haven't really defined the others by what they did, but I'm going to define him straight away. John Christie, serial killer. Now, why are we doing this one? Because this sums up. There's no doubt about this one, or is there? Because actually, he does have a military service that indicates some of the things that would happen, or does it? Anyway, born 8th of April 1899 in the Halifax area, so a bad start. Born in Yorkshire. I mean,
not even Nottingham.
Nottingham, yes, it would be better. He was the sixth of 7 children. Difficult relationship with his father, who was a carpet designer. That must be a difficult job. Ernest Christie. And he was apparently alternatively coddled and bullied by his mother and older sisters. People always try and draw these things and make some great psychological point out of it. I'm unaware of anybody who doesn't have the odd problem with their family. My family certainly have problems with me as an uncommunicative father and shocking bully at times. So there you go.
Family.
No. You get back in your box, Gary. Educated at Halifax Secondary School. He's supposed to be a bright lad, and if you believe in IQs, which I don't, they're ludicrous. He was supposed to have a high IQ.
Sorry, Pete, was he educated at Halifax Secondary School, or did he go to Halifax Secondary School?
You're referring to the famous Liverpool University on my... Peter Hart went to Liverpool University. Nigel Steele was educated at Corpus Christi, blah, blah, blah. Yes, well... Yes, he. I think he was actually educated. He's a bright lad, interested in film. When he leaves school, 1913, he gets a job as assistant cinema projectionist. Not a popular lad, and there's stuff about him having trouble with women, struggling with impotency, and there's the nickname of Reggie No Dick.
Hang on, if you pardon the pun, how does that come up?
Oh no!
At what point in the cinema did somebody want to talk about him being Reggie No Dick?
I think it was girls he encountered in his romantic life. I'm surprised you weren't known as Gary No Dick, now I think of it. Right. Anyway, so now let's get on to the war. And here we're going to quickly use Richard Van Emden's book.
Oh, it's my favourite.
He is your favourite. Famous 1914-1918. I think it's fair to say it's not one of his better books. But it is, as always with Richard's books, interesting and useful. And certainly I found it useful for this. But I'm going along with what Richard says because I trust him as a historian. He was called up in September 16, but then he spends time on the Army Reserve. They don't actually want him in then. He's very young at the time, and he only is mobilised in April 1917. And then he seems to have done his basic training with 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment, fine body of men, often known as the Sherwood Foresters. And they're a young soldiers training battalion. I want to make it clear that when you're looking at people like Christie's service career, there seems to be a lot of confusion. And this is something Richard Van Emden pointed out. You can't seem to find any facts or figures because the person who... the main source for what we know is a liar. and an accomplished liar and somebody who lived lies, if you know what I mean. Anyway, he did a signalling course and then sent as a signaller, and on the 7th of April 1918 was posted to 2nd 6th Sherwood Foresters, which was having a quiet period out of the line, rebuilding. They're broken up on 7th of May and provide drafts. This is during still the aftermath of the spring offensives, and he goes to the Duke of Wellington's regiment as a signaller. Now, Richard guesses, but he is absolutely clear he doesn't know. But from research, he thinks it might have been the 1st 7th Battalion, Duke of Wellington's, who were in the Ypres salient. And in June, they get casualties in a mustard gas attack. And Christie subsequently spent a month in military hospital at Calais with mustard gas poisoning. And Richard pinpoints a gas shelling of 3 other ranks by the door of the HQ of the battalion as a possibility, as when they were. Now, I think we've moved into the we must have, it must be, perhaps it is phase here. So I'll leave it there. And Richard does no more than say, well, he was a signaller and there's 3 of them gassed. That's all. I think you'd be equally doubtful about that, wouldn't you, Jim?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's a reasonable inference, but that's all it can be. It's
an inference. What you've done is you've gone from a certainty to a he went to the Duke of Wellington's, to a possibly the 1st 7th, to a possibly this was the date he was. And I respect what Richard's discovered, and I find it interesting, but that's as far as you can go. 18th of June, he's receiving treatment for gas, and after hospitalisation, he's returned to the UK. Discharged to other duties, never goes back to the front line. Now, Gary, Christie claims quite a lot about this attack, doesn't he? Tell us, give us an idea of what Christie says happened to him as a result of the gas.
Well, he for one thing, he says it left him permanently unable to speak loudly, which we'll see later. Some of the roles he does, that's a bit odd. And at his trial, he also claimed that it had rendered him blind and mute for 3.5 years. Which is quite a serious affliction.
Is there a record of his blindness? Because there would be a record of that, wouldn't there, Jim? There would be a record.
I have found cases when there is hysterical blindness, as it sometimes used to be referred to. It doesn't necessarily appear in the records, but there are other sources which suggest that could be a possibility. But that's a long time to be blind.
And he wouldn't have been discharged as fit, Peter. That's the bottom line. There's no way he would have been discharged as fit.
Now he does get diagnosed as something, a functional aphonia. Now is that struck dumb? But is that through the gas or is that through something else, Gary?
Well, it's supposed to be struck dumb through fear, which that strikes me as just an explanation for something they can't explain.
You mean like pyrexia? My favourite
pyrexia of unknown origin.
Yeah.
What's wrong with him? Well, he's got PUO. What's that? I don't know.
But to him, it's real. He is suffering as far as he is concerned, and he's obviously displaying some symptoms of something, and they've just described it as that.
So he is a liar, but that's recorded. The functional aphonia. The blindness is not, and I'm more dubious about that. But I think, Jim, it could be right. It could be. We could be doing him a disservice. It could be buried in the records or not recorded. But anyway, he's demobilised on 22nd of October 1919, and he has a disability pension of 7 shillings and sixpence for 70 weeks.
Which means that they must have accepted there was something afflicting him.
Yes, but it's the pensions makes me burn with fury. Not Christie's pension. I don't care about him. But honestly,
mine.
Yes, your. It's these pensions that cut off, and also the pensions. Some pensions. Many of the people I interviewed, they were paid a final sum in 1926, and then that was it in final settlement. And you don't.
That was
get
the case
more.
with Christie, wasn't it? He got the pension for a fixed period of time.
Anyway, he continues to have a series of real and imaginary medical complaints. I think there's an account that he went to the doctor something like 240 times or something in a short period of time. Doctor must have loved him. But he does get married to Ethel Waddington, who becomes Ethel Christie, I would imagine, in 1920. A fairly dysfunctional marriage, I'd say. Now, you're an expert on dysfunctional marriages, Gary. Give us an idea of what could go wrong with Christie's marriage.
Well, for one thing, he appears to be impotent, Peter. So that continues. So they've got some real problems, but he seems to have periods where he manages liaisons with, how can I put this, colourful ladies. So prostitutes. Yeah. So he continues to frequent prostitutes.
Now, he briefly joins the RAF.
Fine body of men.
At last, we want to remove from your mind any previous criticism, because the RAF have the good sense to throw him out after a very short period of time.
8 months.
8 months. Well, that's enough to for Christie to check out the local RAF hotels. Anyway, so he's discharged. Now, during these interwar years, he has many, many criminal offences, mainly theft, but there's also one case of assaulting a prostitute. Many short prison terms, and in 1938, December, he moves into the ground floor apartment of 10 Rillington Place. Got to say it like that. Do you remember Valentin Dial? I wanted to have his voice for... Can you do his voice, Jim? You've got a deep manly voice.
I don't think so, no. Not
That's it!
10 Rillington Place being the title of a film starring Attenborough, isn't it?
Richard
Attenborough. Dickie, he likes to be called. Now, the amazing thing is, during the war, what job does this serial criminal get, Gary?
Well, as you described it, they've lowered standards, and he gets a job as a War Reserve Special Constable. And where you've put lowered standard, I've put lowered 3 exclamation marks.
It is.
I mean, it's quite incredible.
Well, a lot of policemen had gone off to war. They need a lot of policemen, need replacements, and clearly they didn't check properly, because he could not possibly have got through. Anyway, as it happens, he seems to have been an excellent policeman. I may, and he has 2 commendations based at Harrow Road police station. This is quite amazing. And then there's an ill-judged affair with a woman civilian worker, and he's beaten up by the annoyed husband or other man friend, and he resigns in 1943. Interesting. How does that fit in with the impotency, Gary? Again, I'm asking you as the expert on these things.
I can't really say. It must be something about illicit sex, I would imagine.
That would fit. Again, your expertise has proved invaluable.
Yeah, hang on. Sorry, can I rephrase the... I don't know, Peter. I have no idea.
Now, his known murders, and I use that because there are suspicions about what he was up to in wartime London. His known murders begin in 1943, and funnily enough, we're not going to endlessly bash on about these, and they go on for 10 years until he's arrested in March.
So do you think there's any connection with his being found out and sacked from the police and the murders starting?
I don't know. I don't know enough about it. It's interesting.
Can you find out and let me know, Pete?
No. He kills in all some 8 victims, mainly by gassing and strangulation, and he hides the bodies around his flat, 10 Rillington Place, which is a ground floor flat, including the one, I know one thigh bone was propping the door open, the back door gate at the back, with the police were out there to arrest somebody else. Never noticed, but then I wouldn't have noticed either. The worst part of it is the conviction of Timothy Evans for the murder of his wife and baby, who were at that time renting from Christie, because of Christie's testimony in court, Evans is prosecuted, and because he was not that bright and was unable to tell a straight story himself also being somewhat of a liar, he was executed, and we're going to come back to that. And then Christie accelerates his killing. The last 3 or 4 were in the last year, and then moves out of the flat, and body bits started. The new tenants started to find bodies everywhere. It's not funny, but he does, doesn't he? And he's sent to trial. Now, what does his defence lawyer say? What defence can there be for murdering 8 people?
This is Mr. Curtis Bennett, a famous QC of the time, and he says he'd been gassed in the First World War, and he was dumb for 3.5 years. He was not physically dumb, but it was psychological dumbness, something to do, you may think, with the mind. He was dumb for 3.5 years and blind for 6 months. And you may think that it's really the beginning of this story. I do not suppose you will think it did him much good.
Now, that's in some senses fair enough, but we know, or I think, some of it's lies. The blindness is very dubious. But also, how far does it excuse you for killing 8 people?
Well, also, there's roughly 15 years between his blindness, leaving the army after the Great War, and 1943 when he starts killing people. There would not have been a 15-year gap, and his defence counsel are trying to draw the view of the jury to this debilitating experience being the reason, and it's bloody nonsense, frankly.
I think it's overtaken now. He was executed. He was hung at Pentonville on the 15th of July 1953. Now, attitudes are quite strange. And when I was looking into this is one. He did his bit in 1916 in the same way as the rest of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. That he turned out to be a deranged killer in later life does not detract from his right to be honoured for his 1916 duty. How do you feel about that?
Can I beg to differ? Can I just say at this moment in time, it bloody absolutely does.
And there's another one here. I'll ask you to comment on this one, Jim, if you could. If he was damaged goods from World War I, then this seems to have been glossed over. But there must have been a number of cases like Christie where PTSD or similar contributed to some grisly crimes. What do you think, Jim? How do you feel about that?
Well, in part, I suppose that's inevitably going to be true. But it sounds like special pleading on behalf of a lot of people, some of whom were anything but special. And we're trying to, we are transplanting our view of the world, here we are in the 21st century, back on those times. We are imagining a world how we think, or we would hope it would be or have been, and we don't know it. We can't possibly make those judgments.
The PTSD thing, I think Christie suffered. That's clear. But the scale of the crimes,
absolutely,
the nature of the crimes, I think it's difficult to think. Now, we're going to finish now, and you've got a story that I'd just like to finish on, because a lot of people think a lot of people have an attitude to murderers, and people like Christie, that they should be hung, the death penalty. And you've got your own perspective of this, haven't you, Jim? Tell us that story, just to finish up with.
When I was at school, when I was 13...
so are we talking about
18th century?
Something like that, Gary.
Round about the time Christie was hung, then?
A little later than that, a little later. It was in the mid-80s. Early 80s.
You've had a very hard life, Jim.
I know, I have. All paid for, but...
And what happened?
So there's a school debate about capital punishment in our English class. And there were lots of people lining up to speak in favour of the death penalty. And I decided I would be the one to speak against it. And I asked my dad about it, and because I did know that he was opposed to the death penalty, and he told me about some stories of miscarriages of justice, most famously 10 Rillington Place. And I went to the library, got the book, and read about what Christie was doing, and he featured largely in what I said. And look, this is the murderer who is a key witness of prosecution, which led to the execution of a man after he killed his wife and his child, and he gets poor old Timothy Evans killed. Anyway, unsurprisingly, the vote came in, and it was in favour of the death penalty. Spool forward a few years, not that many more years. The person who spoke in favour of the death penalty was arrested for murder.
Did they hang him?
No, they didn't. And whilst he was on remand, I must admit I did consider writing to him saying, "Changed your mind, have you?" I didn't, naturally.
Well, that's...
And his sentence was commuted to manslaughter.
Well, there you go. Now, how are we going to tie this all up? I think basically the way we tie it up is say we can't. Because what we're saying is one size does not fit all. They're not heroes all. A lot of them are heroes, some of them aren't. Can you make your mind up in each case? I'm not sure you can. Even with a case like Christie, there are things that you need to think about before issuing a blanket condemnation. Then issue a blanket condemnation, in my view, with Christie. But some of the other cases, I'm not so sure we can be like that. You've raised some great ones, Jim.
Well, I think it's clear that the people were capable of performing heroic deeds who were then later on, and before and afterwards, equally capable of the most appalling crimes. Whether you can therefore say that their experience in war predetermines people to become the criminals that they often became, I doubt it. And a lot of them had been in the dock and were frequent flyers, you could say, long before the war. So the war might have exacerbated something in them, but a lot of these guys were not the people you'd have a pint with to start off with.
Very wise. Talking to people I haven't had a pint with. Gary, what do you think?
Well, I felt uncomfortable about some of them, but that's a good thing, because it meant that I was having to look at it, and that's the point we're trying to make. That don't just immediately react to a post with "Heroes all, rest in peace," whatever. Have a think about it. If you pointed out Jim's excellent Facebook page, Gallipoli 1915. If you read the article and it makes you want to react, go and do a bit of research. Have a look at these people. they're real. They're as real as you and I, and they've got the same strengths and weaknesses. Although none of us are murderers, of course, yet.
No, I mean, we've used some extreme examples today, but...
Well, you would pick in Nottingham.
Yeah, well, it's true. And that's for Hucknall. But point is, surely, these are ordinary people in extraordinary times.
Yes.
And the very fact that you're pointing out that some of these people have got flaws isn't a denigration. It's just a simple reflection, as you said right at the outset, Gary, that it recruited from across society, and therefore people in the army were going to be reflective of all sorts of humanity.
And still are. That's still the case.
I think that's a great way to sum up. Well done, lads. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
young
Jim.
Gary Bain.
Okay.
And thank you, Jim Grundy. You are our new favourite.
Hooray!
Well, no, my favourite's still Richard Van Emden.
Well,
Oh, well.
always will be.
Let's be clear.
All right, sorry.
Cheers, Pete.
Cheers.
Cheers.